For years, people have been told that burning visceral fat is all about eating less and moving more. Yet, millions still struggle because the real problem isn't willpower. It's biology. Visceral fat is stubborn, metabolically active, and deeply connected to your hormones, especially insulin. When insulin stays high, your body locks fat inside your cells, no matter how hard you diet. But when you learn how to target the hormonal pathways that control fat storage, something incredible happens. Your body finally unlocks this dangerous fat and starts burning it instantly. Today, you're going to discover how a simple shift in your daily routine can switch your body from storing mode to burning mode, triggering a metabolic response powerful enough to attack visceral fat at its core. This isn't about shortcuts or magic tricks. It's about working with your biology instead of fighting against it. Visceral fat is hormonally driven, not calorie driven. And this single truth changes the way you look at weight loss forever, because it explains why so many people try diet after diet, cut calories, fight cravings, push themselves harder, yet see almost no change in the fat around their waist. Visceral fat behaves differently from the fat under your skin because it responds directly to hormonal signals, especially insulin, cortisol, and other metabolic regulators. When these hormones are elevated or imbalanced, the body receives a powerful message to store energy, not release it, and it stores that energy primarily in the form of visceral fat. This is why you can meet people who eat very little, yet still carry stubborn belly fat. While others eat more freely and remain lean, the difference lies in the hormonal environment inside their body, not the sheer number of calories consumed. Understanding this turns your attention to what actually drives fat storage at a deep physiological level, and why traditional dieting often fails, because reducing calories without addressing hormones does nothing to unlock the specific type of fat. When you look closely at the root of the problem, you find that the body is constantly communicating through hormones, sending signals about hunger, fullness, fat storage, and energy release. Visceral fat responds aggressively to insulin, the hormone responsible for moving glucose into cells and deciding whether the body should burn or store energy. When insulin is chronically high, the body prioritizes storage, and visceral fat becomes a convenient reservoir. Even small spikes in insulin throughout the day can reinforce a cycle that traps fat inside your abdomen, surrounding your organs and increasing inflammation. This is why people who snack frequently or consume foods that raise blood sugar quickly often accumulate more visceral fat, even when their total calorie intake isn't excessive. The hormonal message is louder and more powerful than a calorie count, and the body listens to hormones first. Another major reason visceral fat is hormonally driven is the influence of cortisol, the stress hormone. When stress levels rise, cortisol signals the body to hold on to energy for protection, a survival mechanism hardwired from ancient times. But in today's world, stress isn't about physical danger. It's about work, finances, sleep deprivation, and constant mental pressure. These modern stressors keep cortisol elevated for long periods, telling the body to store more visceral fat as a buffer against perceived threat. So even if someone is eating well, exercising, or maintaining a caloric deficit, high cortisol can override those efforts and encourage fat to settle deep in the abdominal cavity. People often think they just need more discipline, but the real battle is hormonal, not motivational. Visceral fat is also closely tied to inflammation, which itself is influenced by hormones and metabolic signals. As visceral fat grows, it becomes more active, releasing inflammatory chemicals that interfere with insulin sensitivity and further disrupt metabolism. This means the more visceral fat you have, the easier it becomes to accumulate even more, forming a vicious cycle that isn't broken by calorie reduction alone. Hormonal imbalance fuels the cycle, and only hormonal correction reverses it. This is why approaches like intermittent fasting, low glycemic foods, stress reduction, quality sleep, and strategic intake of healthy fats work so effectively against visceral fat. They lower insulin, calm cortisol, and improve metabolic rhythm rather than simply cutting calories. What people often overlook is that calories are a measurement of energy, but hormones are the instructions that determine what the body does with that energy. You can eat 1,200 calories a day and still gain visceral fat if your hormones are pushing the body towards storage. Conversely, you can eat more calories and still burn fat if your hormones are aligned for fat release. This explains why people who focus on hormonal balance through timing of meals, nutrient choices, and lifestyle changes see rapid and dramatic reductions in visceral fat. Their body finally receives the instruction to let go of stored fat instead of clinging to it. Once you understand that visceral fat responds to hormones, not just calories, you stop blaming yourself, stop relying on willpower alone, and start focusing on the powerful signals your body uses to regulate fat on a deeper level. This awareness gives you control because it shifts your attention from restriction to strategic action, from frustration to alignment with your biology, and from temporary dieting to metabolic transformation. High insulin levels are the primary trigger for visceral fat storage. And once you understand how this hormone works, you begin to see why so many people struggle with stubborn belly fat, even when they're trying everything they can to lose weight. Insulin is more than just a hormone that helps regulate blood sugar. It acts as the body's master storage signal. Every time insulin rises, your body receives a very specific command. Store energy, do not burn it. When insulin stays elevated for long periods, which is extremely common in modern lifestyles, the body shifts into a state where fat cannot be released easily. Visceral fat becomes the most active and responsive to these insulin signals accumulating around the liver, pancreas, and other organs because this location allows the body to store energy quickly and efficiently. This is why people who struggle with insulin resistance often find that their belly fat becomes the first place to grow and the last place to shrink. Because the hormonal environment keeps locking fat inside the abdominal cavity, most people don't realize how many things trigger insulin spikes throughout the day. Every time you eat carbohydrates, especially refined ones like bread, sugar, pastries, rice, and sweetened drinks, insulin rises to help manage the flood of glucose entering the bloodstream. But insulin doesn't only respond to food. It also responds to the frequency of eating. When someone eats 3 meals a day, plus snacks in between, their insulin levels rarely get a chance to fall. This constant stimulation keeps insulin elevated from morning until night, preventing the body from ever switching into a fat-burning state. Even if the total calories consumed are moderate, the hormonal message remains the same. Store fat, especially visceral fat, because the body assumes it has a continuous supply of energy coming in. This is why some people can gain belly fat even while eating what they believe is a healthy diet, because they are unknowingly keeping insulin high through frequent eating or foods that cause rapid spikes. Insulin also interacts with other hormones that play a crucial role in fat storage. When insulin rises, it suppresses hormones like glucagon and growth hormone, both of which are necessary for fat burning. This creates a metabolic environment where burning visceral fat becomes almost impossible. The higher the insulin, the lower the fat-burning potential. Over time, as the body is repeatedly exposed to high insulin, the cells begin to resist its effects, forcing the pancreas to produce even more insulin to maintain normal blood sugar. This insulin resistance becomes a foundation for rapid visceral fat growth because the hormone remains elevated almost constantly. The body stays locked in storage mode, unable to release fat for energy even during times when it should naturally do so, like during sleep or between meals. Another major factor is that visceral fat itself contributes to higher insulin levels. As visceral fat expands, it releases inflammatory compounds that make the body less sensitive to insulin, which causes the pancreas to secrete even more insulin in response. This becomes a vicious cycle. High insulin creates visceral fat, and visceral fat forces insulin even higher. This loop continues until the hormonal environment becomes so disrupted that losing belly fat feels impossible. No matter how hard someone tries with traditional dieting methods, cutting calories doesn't lower insulin in a meaningful way. In many cases, it raises stress hormones, which can make the problem worse. The real solution is understanding how to naturally bring insulin down, so the body gains access to stored energy trapped inside visceral fat. It becomes clear that the timing of meals is just as important as the types of foods consumed. When someone gives their body longer breaks between meals, insulin has the opportunity to fall. When insulin falls low enough, the body is finally able to switch into fat-burning mode and tap into visceral fat reserves for energy. This explains why many people see dramatic changes in belly fat when they adjust their eating window or reduce insulin-triggering foods. The body begins to respond exactly as it was designed to, shifting from storing fat to using it. Lowering insulin doesn't require extreme dieting. It requires understanding the rhythm of how the hormone works and adjusting daily habits to create an environment where insulin naturally drops. As insulin begins to come down, energy levels rise, inflammation decreases, metabolism resets, and fat becomes accessible again. This shift is what allows stubborn visceral fat to finally break down after years of being locked away by hormonal signals. When people start focusing on lowering insulin rather than cutting calories, they experience real and lasting changes because they are addressing the root cause of visceral fat, not just the symptoms of weight gain. Lowering insulin unlocks trapped visceral fat for instant burning. And this single shift in the body's hormonal environment is what makes the difference between constant struggle and sudden breakthrough. When insulin levels drop, the body is finally able to access the energy that has been locked inside visceral fat cells for years. Most people think fat loss is simply about burning calories. But the truth is that the body does not even touch stored fat when insulin is elevated. Insulin acts like a gatekeeper, sealing the fat cells and preventing them from releasing energy. The moment insulin falls low enough, those gates begin to open. Fat that once seemed impossible to lose becomes available for fuel, and the body switches from storing energy to actively burning it. This hormonal shift is what people describe as effortless fat loss, not because they aren't trying, but because they finally removed the biological barrier that was blocking progress. What makes this process feel almost instant is how quickly the body responds to a change in insulin. Even a short period without food or a reduction in high-carb, high-sugar foods gives insulin a chance to drop. The lower insulin falls, the more the body starts breaking down stored triglycerides inside visceral fat cells. These triglycerides are then released as fatty acids and used for energy. This is why people often notice a flatter stomach or reduce bloating within days of lowering insulin. Even if the scale doesn't move dramatically at first, the body is tapping into deep abdominal fat that was previously protected by hormonal signals. It's not magic. It's physiology working exactly as it was designed. When the hormonal lock is removed, the fat begins to burn, and the metabolic shift becomes noticeable very quickly. The reason this feels so powerful is that visceral fat is metabolically active. Unlike subcutaneous fat, which sits under the skin and changes slowly, visceral fat responds aggressively to hormonal fluctuations. When insulin is high, visceral fat grows rapidly because it is the first place the body stores energy. When insulin drops, visceral fat is also the first place the body looks for fuel. This fast response is why lower insulin strategies often produce dramatic early results in the waistline. The body prefers to burn visceral fat because it's closer to key organs and provides quick energy access. So the moment insulin stops sending the store fat signal, the body flips into a mode where breaking down visceral fat becomes efficient and continuous, especially during rest, sleep, and long gaps between meals. It's important to understand that this release of fat is not about starvation or deprivation. It is about allowing the body to return to its natural metabolic rhythm. When insulin is constantly elevated due to frequent eating, snacking, or high carbohydrate meals, the body never gets a signal to burn stored fat. It remains stuck in a feeding state even when no food is coming in. But when insulin is lowered, the opposite happens. The body shifts from fed state to fasted state. And in the fasted state, burning stored fat becomes a default. This metabolic flexibility is what humans were designed for. For thousands of years, people naturally cycle between periods of eating and not eating, allowing insulin to rise and fall in a pattern that prevented excessive fat accumulation. Modern eating patterns disrupt that rhythm, keeping insulin high and visceral fat locked in place. When insulin falls, not only does fat become accessible, but other fat-burning hormones begin to rise. Growth hormone increases, which helps break down fat and preserve lean muscle. Glucagon rises, signaling the liver to release stored energy and continue burning fat. Adrenaline slightly increases, boosting metabolic rate and helping mobilize fat stores. All this happens automatically without effort, as long as insulin is low enough to permit it. This is why people who lower insulin often report feeling more energized rather than drained. Their body is running on clean, stable fuel rather than rapid fluctuations in blood sugar. The release of visceral fat becomes a steady source of energy, helping maintain focus, mood, and stamina throughout the day. The unlocking of visceral fat also improves the body's sensitivity to insulin over time. As fat begins to drain from around the organs, inflammation decreases, and the body becomes more responsive to insulin's natural role. This means future insulin spikes are less severe, making it easier to maintain fat-burning cycles without dramatic effort. Lowering insulin creates a positive metabolic feedback loop. The more fat you burn, the better your hormonal balance becomes, and the easier it is to continue burning fat. This is why many people see their progress accelerate rather than slow down when they consistently follow an insulin-lowering lifestyle. They're not just burning fat, they're shifting their entire hormonal foundation toward a healthier, leaner state. Short fasting windows rapidly activate fat-burning hormones. And this happens because the moment you stop eating, your body starts shifting its hormonal priorities. Most people don't realize that the simple act of not eating is a powerful biological signal. When food is constantly coming in, insulin stays elevated, and the body remains in storage mode. But when you enter a short fasting window, insulin begins to fall, and this drop triggers a chain reaction that pushes the body toward burning stored fat for energy. This shift doesn't require long fasts or extreme routines. Even brief windows without food give the body enough time to lower insulin and activate the hormonal pathways that break down visceral fat. The reason this feels so effective is that fasting works with your biology, not against it. It doesn't force the body to burn fat. It creates the perfect conditions for fat burning to happen naturally. As insulin falls during a fasting window, another key hormone rises, glucagon. Glucagon is the opposite of insulin. While insulin stores energy, glucagon releases it. When glucagon increases, it signals the liver to start breaking down its stored glycogen. And once it begins to run low, the body shifts to burning fat for fuel. This transition happens more quickly than most people expect because the body is constantly monitoring energy supply. Fasting acts like a switch, instantly redirecting your metabolism from taking in energy to accessing the energy already stored inside your fat cells. Visceral fat being close to vital organs becomes a prime target, and the body begins to draw from it efficiently. This makes short fasting windows one of the most reliable ways to tap into stubborn belly fat that feels resistant when you rely solely on traditional dieting. Another powerful hormone released during short fasting periods is growth hormone. Growth hormone rises significantly when insulin is low and when the body enters a fasted state. This hormone helps maintain muscle mass, supports metabolism, and enhances the breakdown of stored fat. People often assume that not eating for a few hours slows the metabolism, but the opposite is true. Growth hormone helps keep metabolism steady while encouraging the body to use fat as its main energy source. This hormonal balance is one of the reasons fasting feels energizing rather than draining. Instead of depending on frequent meals for a quick burst of energy, the body begins pulling from stable, long-lasting fat reserves, leading to more consistent energy levels throughout the day. Short fasting windows also stimulate a subtle rise in adrenaline and noradrenaline. These hormones increase alertness, focus, and energy expenditure. From an evolutionary perspective, this response makes perfect sense. When food was scarce, the body needed more energy and sharper focus to search for nourishment. Instead of slowing down, the body becomes more efficient and alert. This slight increase in metabolic activity helps mobilize fat stores, particularly visceral fat, because the body prioritizes using the fuel closest to critical organs. The combined effect of lower insulin, higher glucagon, increased growth hormone, and a gentle rise in adrenaline creates the perfect environment for visceral fat to be burned rapidly and consistently during short fasting windows. The effectiveness of short fasting also lies in its simplicity. You don't need supplements, special drinks, or complex meal plans. You are using the natural ebb and flow of your hormones. When you avoid eating for a specific period, whether that's 10 hours, 12 hours, or 14 hours, the body finally gets a signal to shift into fat-burning mode. Many people unknowingly prevent this shift by eating from the moment they wake up until late at night. Constant eating keeps insulin elevated and never gives the body a chance to tap into stored fat. A fasting window breaks this cycle, allowing insulin to drop low enough to trigger all the fat-burning hormones that have been dormant for years. This explains why people often notice changes in their waistline before seeing changes on the scale. Visceral fat responds quickly when insulin finally falls. Short fasting windows also help reduce cravings and stabilize appetite over time. When the body adapts to using stored fat for energy, blood sugar becomes more stable and the spikes and crashes that lead to hunger fade away. This makes fasting easier with each passing day because the body becomes metabolically flexible. Instead of depending on frequent meals, the body becomes comfortable switching between using food energy and using stored fat energy. This flexibility is the hallmark of a healthy metabolism. When hunger stabilizes, insulin levels remain more controlled throughout the day, reinforcing the body's ability to continue burning visceral fat consistently. The hormonal balance created by fasting strengthens itself with regular practice, making the process feel increasingly natural. Short fasting windows do not just burn fat, they retrain the body. By giving your hormones the space they need to function properly, you create an internal environment where fat burning becomes automatic. The body begins to recognize fasting periods as opportunities to reset insulin, restore hormonal balance, and draw from the energy that has been sitting unused for years. Over time, these windows reshape metabolism, reduce inflammation, and restore the body's natural rhythm of feeding and fasting, allowing visceral fat to melt away with far greater ease than traditional approaches that focus on calories rather than hormones. Certain healthy fats switch the body into fat-burning mode, and understanding why this happens completely transforms the way you look at nutrition. For years, people have been taught to fear fat, believing that eating fat automatically leads to gaining fat. But the body doesn't work that way. Healthy fats do not trigger insulin the way carbohydrates do. When you eat them, insulin stays low, and low insulin is a key that unlocks stored fat for fuel. Instead of pushing the body into storage mode, healthy fats help stabilize blood sugar, reduce hunger, and create the perfect hormonal environment for burning visceral fat. This is why people who include the right fats in their routines often feel full longer, experience fewer cravings, and naturally shift toward using their own stored fat as energy. The body becomes calmer, more balanced, and more efficient at accessing the deep abdominal fat that's been locked away by years of hormonal imbalance. Healthy fats also slow digestion in a beneficial way, creating a steady release of energy rather than the rapid highs and lows caused by sugars and refined carbohydrates. When digestion slows, insulin rises only slightly, if at all, and the body remains in a state where it can easily access its stored fuel. This slow, stable energy flow allows fat-burning hormones like glucagon to stay active. Without dramatic spikes in blood sugar, the body avoids a crash that leads to urgent hunger and overeating. Instead, metabolism remains stable, appetite becomes more predictable, and the body begins drawing heavily on visceral fat stores. This process feels natural because it's how the body was originally designed to function, using stable, nutrient-dense fats to maintain energy when food intake is limited or irregular. Another powerful effect of healthy fats is their impact on satiety hormones like leptin and ghrelin. When you consume fats such as olive oil, avocados, nuts, seeds, ghee, and fatty fish, they signal to the body that it has received high-quality fuel. This reduces hunger and quiets the constant urge to eat, which is often triggered by blood sugar fluctuations. With fewer eating episodes throughout the day, insulin stays low for longer periods, giving the body repeated opportunities to burn visceral fat. People often notice that once they start replacing processed carbohydrates with healthy fats, their appetite naturally decreases. They don't feel deprived, they feel satisfied. This hormonal shift is essential for sustainable fat burning because it allows the body to operate without the roller coaster of cravings that keep insulin high and fat storage active. Healthy fats also enhance metabolic flexibility. When the body becomes accustomed to using fat as a primary energy source, it becomes easier for it to switch between burning dietary fat and burning stored fat. This switch is a sign of a strong, efficient metabolism. Visceral fat being highly active becomes one of the first places the body pulls energy from when insulin is low and healthy fats are available. This is why combining healthy fats with short fasting windows often accelerates results. The fats keep insulin low and hunger stable, while the fasting windows allow the body to tap deeper into stored energy. Over time, this trains the metabolism to rely less on constant food intake and more on internal reserves. As the body becomes more comfortable in this fat-burning state, visceral fat begins to shrink steadily. Another important factor is inflammation. Many healthy fats contain anti-inflammatory compounds that help reduce the chronic inflammation associated with visceral fat. As inflammation lowers, insulin sensitivity improves, meaning the body can regulate blood sugar with less insulin. Lower insulin means more fat-burning opportunities. Fats like omega-3s from fish, monounsaturated fats from olive oil, and natural fats from whole foods all work together to support hormonal balance and reduce the metabolic stress that leads to fat storage. When inflammation is high, the body is under constant pressure, which often leads to elevated cortisol and insulin levels. Healthy fats help break that cycle by calming the system and restoring hormonal harmony, making it easier to release stored fat. Healthy fats also support the liver, one of the most important organs involved in fat metabolism. The liver processes fats, regulates blood sugar, and determines whether the body stores or burns energy. When the diet is rich in healthy fats and low in high insulin foods, the liver becomes more efficient at producing ketones, a natural byproduct of fat burning. Ketones provide a clean, steady source of fuel for the brain and body. This shift not only improves mental clarity and energy, but also reinforces the fat-burning state. The more frequently the body produces ketones, the more easily it taps into visceral fat. Over time, this becomes a metabolic habit, helping the body prefer stored fat over constant carbohydrate intake. The role of healthy fats in reducing cravings, stabilizing metabolism, and lowering insulin cannot be overstated. They create the internal environment necessary for visceral fat to be released, and they help break the cycle of dependence on sugary, high-insulin foods. As you eat more healthy fats, your body gradually transitions into a rhythm where fat burning becomes a natural, ongoing process. This rhythm is what allows people to finally see changes in their midsection after years of struggle, because the body is no longer fighting its own hormones. It's working with them. Sleep and stress control determine how much visceral fat you store, because both directly influence the hormones that regulate fat storage, hunger, metabolism, and energy balance. Most people underestimate just how deeply sleep quality and stress levels affect their body composition. They assume fat gain happens only because of food or lack of exercise. But your body is constantly responding to internal signals, especially cortisol, insulin, ghrelin, leptin, and growth hormone. When sleep is poor or stress is high, these hormones become disrupted, sending confusing messages that push the body into a state of fat storage, especially deep in the abdominal cavity where visceral fat accumulates. This is why two people can follow the same diet and exercise routine, yet only one sees results. The difference often lies in how their body handles stress and how effectively they sleep, because these two factors determine whether the body is burning fat or protecting it. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, plays a major role in visceral fat accumulation. When cortisol rises, the body receives a survival signal that says, "Store energy." This mechanism was essential in ancient times when stress was tied to physical danger and the body needed quick fuel reserves. But in modern life, stress comes from work, relationships, finances, deadlines, screens, and constant overstimulation. Cortisol stays elevated for long stretches, tricking the body into thinking it needs to hoard energy for protection. The quickest place for the body to store that energy is around the organs, where visceral fat can supply fuel efficiently. Chronically high cortisol also signals the liver to release more glucose into the bloodstream, which triggers insulin to bring that glucose into the cells. The more insulin rises, the more fat is stored. Over time, this cycle becomes deeply ingrained and visceral fat accumulates rapidly, even if calorie intake is not excessive. Sleep deprivation has a similar effect on the body, disrupting hormones in ways that encourage fat storage. When you don't sleep enough, cortisol rises naturally as the body struggles to stay alert. At the same time, leptin, the hormone that signals fullness, drops, while ghrelin, the hormone that triggers hunger, increases. This hormonal imbalance leads to stronger cravings, especially for sugar and refined carbohydrates, because the body is seeking quick energy to compensate for fatigue. These foods spike insulin dramatically, feeding the cycle of visceral fat storage. Combination of high cortisol, low leptin, high ghrelin, and elevated insulin creates a hormonal storm that pushes the body into survival mode. Even if someone is trying to eat well, lack of sleep alone can sabotage progress. The body prioritizes conserving energy and storing fat because it interprets poor sleep as a threat to survival. Another important aspect is that deep sleep is a time when the body produces growth hormone, a key hormone involved in fat burning and muscle repair. Growth hormone rises during the deepest stages of sleep, helping break down stored fat and support metabolic health. When sleep is fragmented or cut short, the body produces far less growth hormone, leading to slower fat burning and reduced metabolic efficiency. Without enough growth hormone, the body struggles to maintain muscle while eliminating fat, and visceral fat becomes even more resistant. Poor sleep also lowers insulin sensitivity, meaning the body needs more insulin to handle the same amount of glucose. Higher insulin levels then reinforce fat storage, making it harder to access visceral fat, even during exercise or fasting. Stress also influences behavior in ways that worsen hormonal imbalance. When cortisol is high, people often seek comfort foods, most of which are high in sugar, salt, and unhealthy fats. These foods provide temporary relief by releasing dopamine, but they also cause insulin spikes and lead to more fat storage. Stress can also reduce the motivation to exercise, disrupt eating schedules, and push people toward late-night snacking, all of which keep insulin elevated. Over time, these habits create a rhythm of hormonal disruption that builds layers of visceral fat. Even in individuals who aren't overeating by traditional standards, the body becomes locked in a cycle of stress-induced storage because it consistently receives messages that survival is uncertain. On the other hand, when stress is managed effectively and sleep is consistent, the hormonal environment shifts dramatically. Cortisol levels begin to normalize, reducing the body's signal to store fat. Insulin becomes more stable, allowing the body to access stored energy instead of hoarding it. Hunger hormones return to balance, making appetite more predictable and reducing cravings for high insulin foods. Growth hormone increases during quality sleep, stimulating fat breakdown and supporting metabolic repair. This combination creates a state where visceral fat becomes easier to burn because the hormones responsible for storage are no longer dominating the system. Even small improvements in sleep duration or stress control can have noticeable effects on belly fat because the body finally receives a signal that it is safe to release stored energy. A well-regulated sleep cycle and stable stress levels give the body the internal rhythm it needs to burn fat consistently. When hormones are aligned, the body naturally shifts from storage mode to fat-burning mode throughout the day and night. Metabolism improves, cravings decrease, energy becomes more stable, and visceral fat begins to shrink as the hormonal pressure to retain it fades away. This is why people who prioritize sleep and stress control often see faster results from their dietary and fasting routines. Their body is no longer fighting them. It is cooperating, responding efficiently to fat-burning cues, and restoring hormonal balance that makes sustainable fat loss possible without feeling overwhelmed or exhausted. Processed carbs and sugar spike insulin and fuel hidden belly fat because they enter the bloodstream rapidly, overwhelming the body with glucose in a very short amount of time. When this happens, insulin must rise quickly to move that glucose into the cells. The faster and higher insulin spikes, the stronger the signal to store fat. And the area that responds most aggressively is visceral fat deep inside the abdomen. Most people don't realize that even small amounts of processed carbohydrates can trigger these powerful hormonal shifts. Foods like white bread, pastries, soda, white rice, breakfast cereals, energy drinks, and sweetened snacks cause sharp glucose surges that force insulin to work overtime. With each spike, the body is pushed further into storage mode. Over time, these repeated episodes become a metabolic pattern, and the body becomes conditioned to store fat around the organs because that is where it can access energy quickly when blood sugar fluctuates. Again, one of the biggest problems with processed carbohydrates is the speed at which they digest. Because they lack fiber and natural structure, the body breaks them down almost instantly. This rapid digestion leaves the bloodstream flooded with glucose, leading to a sudden burst of energy followed by a crash. When blood sugar crashes, hunger intensifies and cravings return even stronger. This leads to overeating or snacking again, usually on the same kind of high insulin foods. Every cycle of spike and crash creates another surge of insulin, reinforcing the body's tendency to store visceral fat. This is why people often feel hungry shortly after eating processed foods. The body isn't receiving sustainable energy. Instead, it's being pushed through hormonal swings that demand more fuel, making fat storage more likely with each bite. Visceral fat becomes especially vulnerable to these insulin spikes because it is designed to store energy quickly. Unlike subcutaneous fat, which takes longer to accumulate, visceral fat responds directly to hormonal messages. When insulin rises repeatedly throughout the day, visceral fat cells become more active and more resistant to releasing stored energy. This means that even if someone eats a moderate amount of calories, the hormonal signals created by processed sugars make the body more efficient at storing fat than burning it. Over time, this leads to insulin resistance, where the cells no longer respond effectively to insulin, forcing the pancreas to produce even more. Higher insulin becomes a new normal, and visceral fat accumulation accelerates in a continuous cycle driven by processed carbohydrates. Another major issue is that processed carbs and sugars create inflammation throughout the body. Inflammation makes cells less responsive to insulin, which again forces the pancreas to release even more insulin to keep blood sugar in balance. As insulin climbs higher, fat storage becomes more aggressive. Visceral fat itself is inflammatory, releasing hormones and chemicals that worsen insulin resistance even further. This creates a metabolic loop where processed foods raise insulin, visceral fat grows, inflammation worsens, and insulin rises even more. Breaking this loop becomes harder the longer it continues, which is why people often feel like their belly fat suddenly becomes impossible to lose after years of consuming processed carbohydrates regularly. Processed sugars also affect hunger hormones in ways that encourage overeating. Ghrelin, the hormone that signals hunger, increases rapidly when blood sugar drops after a spike. Meanwhile, leptin, the hormone that signals fullness, becomes less effective when insulin levels are constantly elevated. This imbalance causes people to feel hungry even when they have consumed enough calories. They crave more food, especially sweet or starchy items, because the body is seeking quick relief from blood sugar instability. This hormonal confusion drives chronic snacking, late-night eating, emotional eating, and compulsive cravings, all of which keep insulin high and prevent the body from burning visceral fat effectively. The psychological impact of processed sugars also plays a role. Sugar triggers dopamine release in the brain, creating a temporary feeling of pleasure or reward. Over time, the brain becomes conditioned to seek this reward repeatedly, forming a pattern that pushes people towards sugar-rich foods, even when they know they shouldn't. This reward cycle can make it difficult to break free from processed carbs, leading to more insulin spikes and even more visceral fat. The combination of hormonal, psychological, and metabolic effects created by processed sugars makes them uniquely powerful at driving belly fat growth compared to whole foods or natural sources of carbohydrates. The liver also takes a heavy hit from processed sugars, especially fructose found in sweetened drinks, syrups, and packaged snacks. Unlike glucose, which the entire body can use, fructose must be processed directly by the liver. When fructose intake is high, the liver becomes overwhelmed and converts much of it into fat. This fat accumulates around the liver itself, contributing to fatty liver disease and encouraging more visceral fat storage. A stressed liver becomes less efficient at regulating blood sugar, which leads to more insulin release, more fat storage, and worsening metabolic health. This is one reason why sugary drinks, even more than sugary foods, are strongly associated with stubborn belly fat. When you eliminate or reduce processed carbohydrates and sugars, insulin begins to stabilize, hunger becomes more manageable, energy becomes steadier, and the body finally gets a break from the constant hormonal pressure to store fat. With insulin under control, the body can shift back into fat-burning mode, allowing visceral fat to become accessible again. This is why people often see dramatic changes in their waistlines soon after removing processed carbs from their routine. The hormonal environment shifts rapidly, and the body begins to reverse years of fat storage driven by insulin spikes and blood sugar instability. Consistency and routine makes visceral fat reduction sustainable because fat loss isn't about one-time efforts or occasional bursts of discipline. It's about creating predictable patterns that work with your body's hormonal rhythms. Visceral fat responds to hormones like insulin, cortisol, growth hormone, and glucagon. And these hormones respond to regularity in eating, sleeping, movement, and stress management. When your routines are inconsistent, Insulin spikes, cortisol surges, and fat storage pathways remain active, making it difficult for the body to release stored energy. But when habits are repeated day after day, the body begins to anticipate patterns, adjust hormone release accordingly, and gradually shift from storage mode to fat-burning mode. This is why people often see long-term results from simple, consistent routines rather than extreme diets or intense, sporadic workouts. One of the key aspects of consistency is meal timing. Eating at roughly the same times each day allows insulin levels to rise and fall predictably. The body can enter fat-burning mode during periods between meals when insulin drops. If eating times vary widely or frequent snacking occurs, insulin remains elevated almost constantly, preventing visceral fat from being mobilized. Consistent meal timing combined with appropriate macronutrient choices supports stable blood sugar and reduces hormonal stress on the body. This creates repeated windows where the body can access stored fat. The more predictable these windows are, the more efficiently visceral fat begins to shrink over time. Exercise consistency is another major factor. Short bursts of movement, resistance training, and cardiovascular activity all influence hormones related to fat storage and fat burning. While a single workout can provide temporary benefits, repeated activity trains the body to respond more effectively. Hormones like growth hormone and adrenaline increase during exercise, promoting fat mobilization, and when activity is consistent, these hormones remain responsive over time. Inconsistent workouts, on the other hand, fail to create the same hormonal adaptation, leaving the body less able to access visceral fat efficiently. Even moderate repeated activity compounds over weeks and months, producing measurable changes in abdominal fat because the body learns to use stored energy more reliably. Sleep consistency is equally critical for sustainable visceral fat reduction. Going to bed and waking at roughly the same times every day regulates circadian rhythms, which control cortisol release and growth hormone production. Poor or irregular sleep disrupts these hormones, leading to higher stress levels, increased insulin resistance, and greater fat storage around the abdomen. Consistent sleep patterns allow the body to restore itself hormonally each night, creating a metabolic environment where visceral fat can be burned steadily over time. This repeated alignment of sleep with the body's natural rhythms has a compounding effect on fat reduction and overall metabolic health. Hydration and nutrient consistency also play a role in supporting hormonal balance. Drinking water regularly, maintaining electrolyte levels, and consuming nutrient-dense foods at consistent intervals prevent fluctuations in blood pressure, energy, and metabolism that can trigger stress responses. Inconsistent intake, especially dehydration or nutrient deficiencies, can raise cortisol, impair insulin sensitivity, and make the body more likely to store fat. Over time, maintaining steady hydration and nutrient patterns reinforces the body's ability to release stored visceral fat, making fat loss more predictable and reliable. Stress management is another area where consistency matters. Short bursts of relaxation or meditation may provide temporary relief, but consistent daily practice is necessary to lower cortisol and reduce its fat-storing effects over time. Chronic stress creates a hormonal environment that favors visceral fat accumulation, and inconsistency in managing stress prevents the body from rebalancing. Regular stress reduction techniques, even for small periods each day, gradually reshape the hormonal landscape, allowing the body to prioritize fat burning instead of fat storage. Consistency also strengthens habits that support insulin management. Eating balanced meals, avoiding processed sugars, incorporating healthy fats, and timing fasting windows become easier when repeated reliably. The body begins to anticipate these patterns, which stabilizes insulin and encourages fat mobilization. When these habits are inconsistent, insulin fluctuates wildly, preventing the body from ever entering an optimal fat-burning state. By creating predictability in dietary and lifestyle routines, the hormonal environment shifts steadily toward visceral fat reduction. Mental consistency is equally important. Following a routine day after day reinforces discipline and reduces decision fatigue. When the body and mind operate predictably, cravings are easier to resist, stress responses are more manageable, and adherence to healthy habits becomes second nature. This alignment of mind, body, and routine ensures that visceral fat reduction is not just temporary, but sustainable because the body is continuously operating in a state conducive to fat burning. Consistency and routine also amplifies the effects of other fat-burning strategies. Fasting windows become more effective. Exercise produces stronger hormonal responses, and sleep enhances growth hormone production. All of these small but repeated actions compound over time, leading to measurable reductions in visceral fat. When the body experiences regularity in these areas, the hormonal signals that previously encouraged storage are suppressed, while those that promote fat mobilization are strengthened. This ongoing reinforcement is what transforms temporary results into long-lasting changes, making visceral fat reduction both achievable and maintainable. Processed sugars, refined carbohydrates, and high glycemic foods are silent drivers of visceral fat because they create repeated hormonal surges that push the body into storage mode. Every time you consume sugar or processed carbs, your blood glucose rises rapidly and insulin must spike to bring that glucose into cells. Insulin is not just a blood sugar regulator. It is the primary fat storage hormone. When insulin is elevated, the body receives a signal to store energy rather than burn it. And visceral fat, being metabolically active and close to vital organs, becomes the primary reservoir. Even if overall calories are moderate, these hormonal fluctuations can override energy balance and trap fat around the abdominal organs. People often think that losing belly fat is a matter of willpower or cutting calories. But in reality, it is about controlling the hormonal environment, particularly insulin, which dictates whether fat is burned or stored. The problem is compounded by the speed at which processed sugars digest. Unlike whole foods with fiber, fat, or protein, refined carbohydrates are absorbed almost instantly, flooding the bloodstream with glucose. This rapid spike triggers a significant insulin response. As insulin rises, the body immediately prioritizes energy storage, particularly in visceral fat cells. These cells are highly sensitive to insulin and respond aggressively by taking in and retaining fat. The result is that the more frequently someone consumes high glycemic foods, the more their body is trained to store visceral fat, and the less likely it is to release it for energy. Over time, repeated insulin spikes lead to insulin resistance, which forces the pancreas to produce even more insulin, reinforcing the cycle of fat accumulation and creating a metabolic environment where visceral fat is particularly stubborn. Beyond insulin, high sugar and high carb foods also affect other hormones that influence fat storage. Cortisol, the stress hormone, often rises in response to rapid blood sugar swings, signaling the body to hold on to energy. Chronic elevation of cortisol combined with insulin spikes amplifies the storage of visceral fat. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, also rises after a sugar crash, driving cravings for more high glycemic foods. Meanwhile, leptin, the satiety hormone, becomes less effective when insulin is consistently high, making it harder for the body to recognize fullness. This combination of hormonal disruption leads to overeating, late-night snacking, and frequent small meals, all of which keep insulin elevated and visceral fat locked in place. Visceral fat itself contributes to the problem because it is not just passive storage. It is metabolically active and produces inflammatory cytokines that interfere with insulin signaling. As inflammation rises, insulin resistance increases, and the body requires more insulin to handle normal glucose levels. This further reinforces fat storage. The more visceral fat accumulates, the more the hormonal imbalance worsens, creating a feedback loop that is difficult to break through diet alone. Reducing processed sugars and refined carbohydrates is critical because it interrupts the cycle, lowers insulin levels, and allows visceral fat to become available as an energy source. The liver also plays a key role in how processed sugars influence fat storage. High intake of fructose, commonly found in sodas, syrups, and packaged snacks, forces the liver to metabolize it directly. When the liver is overloaded with fructose, it converts much of it into triglycerides, which are stored as visceral fat or contribute to fatty liver. A stressed liver cannot effectively regulate blood sugar or insulin, which further drives fat accumulation around the abdominal organs. This explains why people who consume large amounts of sugary drinks and refined carbs often develop significant belly fat, even if they appear moderate in body weight elsewhere. Processed sugars also impact energy regulation and appetite. The rapid rise and fall of blood glucose creates cycles of energy spikes followed by crashes, which the brain interprets as low energy. These crashes stimulate cravings for quick energy sources, usually more sugar, perpetuating a cycle of insulin elevation and fat storage. As insulin remains high, the body cannot access stored visceral fat, meaning energy must come from food rather than internal reserves. This dependency on constant carbohydrate intake reinforces the storage of visceral fat and makes fat loss extremely difficult without addressing the root hormonal cause. Over time, consistent consumption of high glycemic foods trains the body to expect constant energy input, preventing it from tapping into stored fat. The metabolic system adapts to the high insulin environment, and visceral fat continues to grow as a protective energy reserve. When sugar and processed carbs are reduced or eliminated, insulin begins to stabilize, cortisol levels normalize, and the body receives a clear signal to release fat. Hormonal balance gradually returns, allowing visceral fat to be mobilized efficiently. The combination of lowered insulin, reduced inflammation, and improved liver function creates a state where the body can finally access and burn stored fat, which is why controlling sugar intake is one of the most effective strategies for tackling stubborn visceral fat accumulation. Small daily habits can trigger powerful hormonal changes for fat loss, and when these habits are repeated consistently, they create a metabolic environment that encourages the body to release visceral fat naturally. Most people underestimate the cumulative effect of minor actions taken every day. Drinking water first thing in the morning, consuming a protein-rich breakfast, taking a brisk walk, avoiding late-night snacking, or practicing a few minutes of mindfulness might seem insignificant on their own. But each of these habits sends a signal to the body that affects insulin, cortisol, glucagon, and growth hormone. Hormones are the true drivers of fat storage and fat burning, and by making small, deliberate choices every day, you can gradually shift the hormonal landscape to favor fat release rather than storage. This is why sustainable fat loss is rarely about extreme interventions and more about consistent, smart daily routines. Hydration is one of the simplest yet most overlooked habits. Drinking water regularly, particularly before meals, helps regulate blood sugar, supports kidney and liver function, and slightly raises metabolism. When the body is well hydrated, insulin sensitivity improves, meaning blood sugar is handled more efficiently and spikes in insulin are smaller. Lower insulin allows the body to access stored fat, particularly visceral fat, more readily. Many people experience bloating or weight gain simply because they are chronically dehydrated, which can interfere with metabolic processes. A small habit like drinking adequate water daily becomes a catalyst for hormonal stability and fat mobilization. Another impactful habit is consistent protein intake. Eating moderate amounts of protein at each meal supports muscle maintenance and stimulates the release of hormones like glucagon, which promote fat breakdown. Protein also reduces hunger by influencing satiety hormones, such as leptin, preventing overeating and helping maintain steady insulin levels. When insulin remains stable, the body is able to burn stored visceral fat more efficiently rather than constantly holding on to it over time. This consistent support of hormonal balance through protein intake contributes to a sustained reduction in abdominal fat. Movement throughout the day is another critical habit. You don't need long, intense workouts to influence fat-burning hormones. Short bursts of activity such as walking, stretching, or climbing stairs trigger the release of adrenaline and growth hormone, both of which encourage the body to mobilize stored fat. Consistency is key. Repeated small doses of activity throughout the day keep the metabolism responsive and signal to the body that energy can safely be used. These microactions compound, creating a hormonal environment where visceral fat becomes accessible as a source of energy. Sleep hygiene is another daily habit with profound hormonal effects. Going to bed and waking up at roughly the same time every day regulates cortisol and growth hormone release, which directly impacts fat storage and fat burning. Poor or inconsistent sleep leads to elevated cortisol, impaired insulin sensitivity, and increased hunger hormones, all of which promote visceral fat accumulation. Prioritizing regular quality sleep every night ensures that fat-burning hormones are active and storage hormones are minimized, creating a powerful foundation for long-term fat reduction. Mindfulness and stress management are small but powerful habits that influence cortisol, the stress hormone that drives visceral fat storage. Brief daily practices such as meditation, deep breathing, or journaling can reduce chronic stress levels, allowing insulin and cortisol to stabilize. When these hormones are balanced, the body no longer feels the need to store energy aggressively in the visceral fat region, and fat mobilization becomes easier. Even a few minutes of daily mindfulness can compound over weeks, shifting the hormonal environment in a way that supports sustained fat loss. Timing of meals is another subtle habit with a major impact. Establishing consistent eating windows, limiting snacking, and allowing periods without food give insulin the opportunity to drop. Lower insulin signals the body to access stored fat, particularly visceral fat, as energy. When these eating patterns are practiced daily, the body becomes accustomed to alternating between fed and fasted states, creating a rhythm where fat-burning hormones remain active and storage hormones are suppressed. Consistency in this rhythm reinforces the hormonal cues needed to burn abdominal fat effectively. Another small but meaningful habit is reducing processed sugars and refined carbohydrates. Replacing these with fiber-rich vegetables, whole grains, and healthy fats keeps insulin stable, reduces cravings, and prevents repeated spikes that drive fat storage. Even minor adjustments, such as swapping a sugary drink for water or fruit, can improve insulin dynamics and signal the body to release stored fat. When practiced every day, these choices have a compounding effect, gradually transforming the body into a fat-burning state. Incorporating these small, manageable habits creates a cascading effect on metabolism and hormones. Each habit, hydration, protein intake, movement, sleep, stress management, meal timing, and dietary choices interact with the others to reinforce a hormonal environment that promotes visceral fat loss. Over time, the body adapts to these consistent cues. Fat-burning hormones become more active, insulin and cortisol stabilize, and stored fat begins to diminish steadily. The power of daily habits lies not in their individual intensity, but in the repeated signals they send to the body, reshaping metabolism and unlocking visceral fat reserves naturally.